Welcome everyone, and great, we're also recording. Welcome everyone, and good morning to those of you who are joining us in Australian time, and also a more general hello to those of you who are based in other time zones. Welcome to this webinar on non-state actors and global environmental governance in China. This event is hosted by the Governance and Regulation Research Network at the Centre for Global Business at Monash Business School. My name is Petra May, and I'll be generally chairing the session and seeing if I can keep our speakers to time. And I'd also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Michael Spencer, who is the organising brains behind this webinar. I also wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land Monash University operates. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Attendees may be based elsewhere, so we also pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land from wherever you are joining us. Just a few housekeeping matters to begin with. Please note that we are recording the webinar and we will make it publicly available afterwards. On the program today, we have 4 great presentations, and this will then be followed by a panel discussion and time for questions from the audience. So please keep your microphones on mute for now, but you are welcome to post questions in the chat as we proceed through the presentations, and we will aim to get to these questions at the end. In the interest of time, I will provide just brief introductions to our speakers, but their full bios are available on our event page, and I think a link is being posted to that event page in our chat. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Dan Gutman from Tianjin University Law School, who will outline the central thesis of the book titled Non-State Actors in China and Global Environmental Governance, which was published with Palgrave Macmillan last year.
So let me.
So over to you, Dan, if you'd like to share your screen.
Yep. Can you see this now?
We can, thank you.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with so many old and new friends in this COVID period. Let me give a brief background of the book and then hopefully a summary. When I came to China as a Fulbright scholar in 2004, I was surprised that everybody spoke pretty good English, but more surprised that they were using the same words that were used in universities and think tanks in Washington, words like NGO, transparency, PPP, policy. And I said, well, what do they mean? And my friends would say, well, of course, they have Chinese characteristics. Zhongguo Tosu. At the Cold War's end, the Western China experts thought that the Chinese characteristics would fade away and the systems would become similar. And my China students and colleagues made clear they understood that no, when ideas and concepts are transplanted from one side of the river to the other, the name may be the same, but the fruit may be different. And in 2022, we're now aware that history is not over. The world is not flat. The systems, in fact, may be different. And so with that in mind, about 2007-8, Oren Young and I and Chinese colleagues began a series of workshops to figure out how to translate similar words, similar concepts among systems. The idea was to bring together small groups of practitioners and scholars to brainstorm frameworks for use in research and practice and do articles and books. And in 2016, Jingyi Jia at Fudan, now the Dean of IGPP, hosted a workshop on non-state actors. The comparative study of non-state actors, some of you know, was pioneered by Canberra University's Roger Wettenhall. The Fudan workshop brought together 24 scholars, practitioners from China, US, Australia, and Brazil, and led to the current book. So the background, why study non-state actors? Governments are big, but challenges in environment are bigger. The US Environmental Agency in Washington has about 15,000 civil servants, plus thousands of contractors. I was really surprised. China, a bigger country, we all know the environmental challenges, but only about 500 civil servants in the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And in addition, today, we all know about cross-border environmental challenges, multinational companies, supply chains across borders. So the concept of non-state actors, a Western concept, includes but is not limited to NGOs, also includes enterprises, citizens, policy entrepreneurs. And so it's bigger than the NGO concept, which has often been studied by Western scholars. Of course, terms like NGO and non-state actors don't have a uniform meaning in the West, may mean different things between EU countries and US countries. Roger Wettenhall introduced me to the notion of quangos, which I'm sure anybody in the Commonwealth is familiar with, and I'm not sure I can explain. So the core comparative questions we set out to study when we began the workshop at Fudan was, who occupies the space? The Chinese concept is Kongjian, occupied in the West by what we call non-state actors. So the first part of our book sets out to develop what we call the landscape of Chinese non-state actors. Once we have the landscape, how do we compare how the systems work? And here we developed, Oren was particularly important, two concepts, which I'll explain briefly. One was streams of influence and the other mechanisms of change. And we use these for the case studies in the book. And so the China non-state actor community, first, what is the landscape? So there are about 4 or 5 different types. Western non-state actors have been present in China since the early 1980s. World WWF, perhaps the first and most famous, then any number others, Forestry Stewardship Council, many others. And of course, ISO, the International Standards Organization, is a non-state actor. But there are 2 that are particularly interesting and important that are very rarely studied by Western scholars, other than Ija, perhaps Chinese scholars. The first is something called Xie Danwei, translated as public service units. As far as I understand, there is no ready equivalent, certainly in the US. Xie Danwei are not government, and the people in them are not civil service, but they are sponsored by the government of the party. They include universities such as Fudan and Peking, research institutes such as China Science Academies, hospitals. In relation to the work of government, they serve as the planning and the policy workforce for most government agencies. The Environmental Ministry has an Academy of Environmental Planning. At the local level, they are the workers who do the compliance and monitoring. Pudong, the signature part of Shanghai, 6 million people, maybe 30 civil servants, over 100 Xie Danwei people doing the compliance and monitoring. Perhaps a surprise to many, over close to 900,000 legally registered China civil society organizations. The China Daily, an English language paper, calls these NGOs. So I think many of you would be surprised, if you're not Chinese, to know 900,000 or so NGOs. Here, there are 2 types of direct relevance to our work. One is the one that's most interesting to me, Shihui Tanti, business associations. Of course, we have many of those in the West, but there's very limited study of the important role they're playing now in China, developing standards for environment, sustainability, even human rights. Under China standards law, Shihui Tanti have the authority to make legally recognizable voluntary standards, a chapter in our book. Minban Fei Chia are closer to what we in the West might call NGOs. Relatively speaking, I think less consequential. There are some that are very important. 2, Friends of Nature, which does actually public interest law litigation, and IPA, which Ding Shenzheng will talk about, very, very famous for its work on open information. And finally, corporate social responsibility. May be surprised if you're not Chinese, CSR is basic in China. A difference is in the West, it's driven by stockholders or consumers, or maybe the corporate officers. In China, it's driven by the leaders. So you have the state council saying state-owned enterprises have to have CSR, stock exchange guidelines. And here, there's a relation with the role of non-state actors who are from the West in China making the guidelines. And so with the landscape in hand, how do we compare the system? So Oren gave us 2 concepts. One is streams of influence. What is the purpose of the non-state effort? And what are the institutional arrangements? So these are simply explained, I hope. One is helping government work, helping enforce rules. So we'll hear from Ding Chen about IPE tries to use government information to put pressure on companies and local governments to follow the rules. Non-state actors also are making rules to apply to enterprises. Michael and Jen, Alliance for Water Stewardship, trying to create standards and then get enterprises to follow them. And then enterprises themselves. So today we have companies like Walmart, which are saying we want to be the first to get ahead of the game and we'll be writing the rules for our supply chain. So it's streams of influence, mechanisms of influences. Why should anybody listen to a non-state actor? They don't have a police force. They can't put you in jail. And so how does this work? And we'll hear from Ding Chen and Michael and Jen about how it works with their two organizations. Finishing up, I do want to emphasize again the importance of the trade associations. Almost no Western literature on China trade associations. The story is that 30 years ago or so, they began to learn from the global non-state actors, WWF, World Wildlife, for example, Forestry Stewardship Council, how to set standards. And today, almost every area of commerce in China, as in the West, there's a trade association. And starting in 2005 or so, with the Textile Association, began to make sustainability standards, not only for the companies in China, but for China going abroad. So as an example, that's a surprise to many of my Chinese colleagues, we all know one of the key resource issues in the world today are the cobalt and lithium. That's going to be part of all the new technologies. A lot of it comes from mining in Africa and other places. In 2015, 2016, there was Greenpeace, Amnesty International wrote about child labor in cobalt in the Congo. Well, who began to write standards? The China Minerals Trade Association, working with the OECD and the UN. So we have global standards for going abroad of deep impact globally, not in China. And who is looking at and who is studying? So finally, a conclusion, revisiting the non-state actor concept, and we're going to get into this in discussion, trends and questions. First point is the Western concept of non-state actors does not capture the emerging China landscape. First, of course, the boundaries between state and non-state are different in China than in other countries. Second, Xie Danwei, critically important, have no Western analog as far as I know. Shihui Tuanti, plenty of Western trade associations, but there's extremely little, as far as I can tell, and I see some real scholars, Catherine Willem and Lydia Price on the webinar, very little Western attention. Similarly, CSR, Lydia Price is perhaps the expert on China CSR. How does it compare to the West? And now, as a global model, what the West can learn from China and global standard setter. How will China non-state actor standard setting for going abroad, Belt and Road, affect global as well as China trade and investment? So again, Africa, cobalt mining, for example, this is something that's critical to Apple, to Samsung, to all of the world's, most of the world's electronic companies. How will this standard setting by China affect what's going on? How will China non-state actors efforts in standard setting and enforcement reflect China's role as maybe the world's greatest developing country, but also, my China friends say, a developing and developed country. So it's both thinking about development and thinking about being the world leader. And in 2022, we all know very great global tensions, China, US, Australia. The non-state actors are, we say in England, canaries in the coal mine. What do they do when they are making standards and the Western multinationals and the China companies may have different interests? How do they respond? What rules? And finally, and I'm sure Oren is probably going to ask about this, in this time of global governance challenges, what's the bottom line? Will all these non-state actors actually work together to improve global sustainability and life quality? Or is it just as my Chinese students say, fei hua kong hua, empty words, not much? Finally, when I first was in China, one of the great pleasures was going to bookstores. It was amazing. There were so many young people actually reading books. Now we know not so many bookstores, and in the US, if it's more than 144 characters, and nobody will read it because it won't be on Twitter. So thank you. I hope I got in 12 minutes less than that. Tian
Thank
should
you
be,
very much, Dan. Wonderfully kept to time. And thank you for the introduction to today's topic and also to your fabulous book, which I'm sure people will read.
Stop screen. There you go.
Great, thank you. We will turn now to our next speaker, Shanshan Ding from the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, or IPE, who will be speaking about IPE's work on supply chain sustainability in China. Please go ahead, Shanshan.
Okay, thanks. So you can see my screen and hear me, right? Okay, cool. Right, so as was introduced, I'll briefly talk about supply chain sustainability that IP has been working. Sorry. Okay, so very briefly, as Dan has introduced just now, so IP is a non-governmental organization based in Beijing, China. So we were founded back in 2006 by our founder, and since our establishment, there's one thing that we have been promoting, and that is information disclosure, particularly environmental information. The reason we're promoting this is because we believe that once more environmental information is being disclosed, we can engage with multi-party stakeholders to participate in pollution control in China and to promote the green development and sustainable development. So this has been something that we've been working for over 16 years now. And the core we would say product or core work we have been doing is creating this environmental database. So we actually track more than 5,000 data sources every day. And once that data sources provide update new information or issue environmental violation records, because it's an environmental bureau website, we would collect it by machine and then manually screen it and clean it and put into our database. So this is the work that we have been doing for the entire 16 years. And once we have this database, we think we need to make it into use. And so back in 2007, IP and other 20 environmental NGOs in China launched a campaign called green consumption. So we're calling for consumers to consider the product sustainability when they buy things. We also call for brands who source from China to consider the environmental impact along their supply chain. So what we're telling the brands is that now you have a blue map database. Do not tell me that you don't know how your suppliers perform in China, because very easily you can screen your supplier and check their name in our database and see whether they have violation records. And those violation records come from the environmental protection bureaus of different levels in China. So it's not IP as a Chinese NGO telling you that your supplier in China violate the local environmental laws and regulations. It's actually the environmental protection bureaus in China. They went out enforcing the law. They found that the supplier probably discharged wastewater over their discharge standard, or do not operate with an environmental permit. We have that in the database. And so now brands, you need to identify those suppliers and ask them to take corrective action, make a public disclosure about why they had this violation, what kind of corrective action they've taken, and what is their environmental compliance status now. And once you've done that, you should also ask them to, calculate how much water they emit every year and discharge into the environment. So this has been something that we've been promoting since 2007. To facilitate this, we also developed an index called Green Supply Chain CITI evaluation with the American NGO and RDC back in 2014. And this was named CITI Index book. But recently we've sort of changed it from Corporate Information Transparency Index, its initial name, to Green Supply Chain CITI Evaluation, because we do promote corporate information transparency, but we also think it's so important that information is not disclosed for the sake of disclosure. It actually drives actions and drives changes. So this CITI index evaluates brands from 5 different aspects, from compliance to corrective action, to whether they extend the green supply chain practice to upstream supply chain, and whether they ask suppliers to disclose environmental information, but also I'll share later as well carbon data. So because we so much focus on environmental and climate aspects of impacts of the supply chain, especially the upstream supply chain, where more environmental impact and heavier carbon footprint actually lie, we think that CITI is an important contribution to the global sustainability initiatives such as the UN SDG and other disclosure requirements such as GRI. So as you can see now that we've been working CITI for 8 years, and now it is more and more, recognized by brands who source from China, both Chinese brands and international brands. So this has been serving. So CITI is also serving as a roadmap where we ask brands to or we tell them how to actually green your supply chain in China. And that's basically what I shared just now, is using our database, do the identification, and then using your purchasing power to ask a supplier to improve their environmental performance. And only when they improve their environmental performance and do the disclosure, will they be able to get more orders. So they have, extra motivation in addition to the fines and the requirement from the government to actually make a change and improve their own environmental performance. But as we've been saying, and this is what actually comes out from this year's annual report, is we have seen a lot of brands, also brands I've shown in the previous pages, who have been using IP's database, with, performing really great with CITI. For example, Scheffler is, for those who look into the supply chain issues, it's a really big name, because back in 2016, they experienced a serious disruption in their supply chain in China because one of their suppliers had violation records and was put on halt of their production. But recently, after communicating for quite a few years, they now start using our databases to identify issues and potential risk along their supply chain. So in a way, controlling their supply chain resilience as well. But then on the other hand, we also see way more brands who source from China, such, for example, Tesla, who has a really big supply chain now in China. And now that they have a gigafactory in Shanghai, who still haven't really looked into their supply chain issues. Last year, we wrote actually 2 reports on Tesla's suspected suppliers with violation record, sent a couple of emails to their headquarters. We only received 1 reply from their China factory, who said that they have looked into the issue, but so far we haven't heard anything about any of their supplier making public disclosure regarding how they have taken the corrective action. Therefore, we don't know whether brands like Tesla are managing their supply chains in China. On the other hand, in spite of brands like Tesla, who still hasn't done many things, we do see a lot of, especially textile brands who are early starters in supply chain management, actually, working hard to not just making sure their suppliers in China are in compliance with local regulations and rules, which is really the basics. They also ask their suppliers to calculate environmental data. For example, this one is actually a poster that CNA shared in their local stores in China. They said that one of their suppliers has, worked with them to reduce energies and waters and chemicals, and they actually asked their supplier to calculate and publish that data publicly on our website as well. So we can see from the supplier data that the number, the amount of wastewater that this particular supplier discharge actually does go down. So this is something that the CITI has been sort of pressuring, using as an index of pressuring brands to not just ask their supplier to be in compliance, but really tracking how much of an environmental impact their supply chain generated, and making that information public as well. One other thing that we have been promoting by CITI is supply chain transparency. I think many of you might be aware that more and more brands are being transparent about their supply chain, especially textile brands. They have issued their list of suppliers, but sadly, most of the lists are in English only. So as a public in China, it's very difficult for them to track actually how the brand supply chain, performing environmentally in China. But we have been promoting this green supply chain map with NRDC since 2018. And what we do is we would, and those brands do actually work with IP. We don't just take their, public list and put on the map. We work with those brands, and then they give us a list in China, and we mark them on the map. But we also link that supplier with their environmental data, whether it's about violation or public, environmental information disclosure. This way, we allow actually the public and the more general stakeholders to be able to track how the supply chain of a brand actually is in China. So till now, we have like 24 brands on the map, and these includes not just textile brands, but also from personal care industries, but some of the IT industry as well. And lastly, I'll also update here with called another index we developed, which is kind of part, covered in Dan's book. Back then it was called CITI, and last year we updated to Climate Action Transparency Index, CITI. So basically we created a separate index from CITI, in the light of the dual carbon, so the dual carbon target that China announces as a nation back in 2020. So in the CITI index, we again, we evaluate how multinationals who source from China perform or look into their supply chain carbon emissions, because we all know the supply chain, especially brands who outsource the productions to suppliers, supply chain emissions actually account for way more, or the vast amount of the carbon emissions for a brand. But sadly, not all brands are looking into their supply chain emissions. They only look into their scope 1 and scope 2, so how their headquarters reduce their carbon, or their data center reduce the carbon, but they don't look into the purchase goods and services. So we created this index to direct brands to look into how their supply chain carbon emission is, and motivate them to set targets and ask their suppliers in China to track their emissions and reduce their own carbon emissions. So as you can see here, this is one of the figures that we get from this year's CITI report. So we see that actually more and more brands, because of the SCTI work, because of the CITI work we've been doing, is actually motivating the suppliers to set intensity and absolute reduction targets. So instead of just like brands setting one, overall emission reduction targets along their supply chain, now we are using CITI to direct brands to ask their own supplier to set their very own emission reduction targets. Empowering them to actually taking the initiative to reduce their carbon. And this is one supplier that's been motivated by one textile brand. They have been tracking their own carbon emissions for more than 5 years now, and also making this data publicly available. So using that data, we can see how, back in 2016, this is the baseline emissions, and this is how they've been reducing for the past 5 years. And this is the, by 2025, they actually has like an absolute reduction target of 25%. So we think that CITI, it's a very, we've only been doing it for 1 year, but this is definitely, we're seeing how CITI is able to pressure brands to really look into their supply chain emissions and asking and empowering and enabling those suppliers in China to do their own emissions. So this allows, make a contribution for brands' scope 3 emission reduction targets, but also contributing to, China's dual carbon target to be achieved. Lastly, just adding a little bit before I finish is, in addition to, supply chain aspects from leveraging sort of the purchasing power from brands, we also see recently that a new development in the green finance or, the banking side. We see that more and more banks in China are making use of the environmental data. And with IP, working now with more than 10 banks, those banks are using our data to check and see their lending companies. So any company who wants to apply for a loan from a commercial banks, whether they have environmental violations. And since last year, those banks are asking those lending companies to measure their own carbon emissions as well. So we see that in addition to supply chain, the green lending or green finance side also put an extra motivation for suppliers and facilities in China to look into their environmental impact and carbon emissions. So hopefully this aspect would be something becoming more promising in the coming years as well, so that facilities in China can have more motivations. And this is really achieving what we have been hoping back in 2006, is multi-stakeholders joining in an effort to reduce the carbon emissions and reduce the pollutions, and really making a contribution to the green transformation in China. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shanshan. We will keep moving on to our next speakers. So next we have Dr. Michael Spencer from Monash Business School, who is also the organizer of this event. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Petra. I'm just trying to find my screen share. Here we go. Coming. Can you see that? Are we good? Petra?
Yes, we can see 2 slides at the moment though.
Okay.
That's fine.
So see if that improves. Is that
That's
better?
it. That's perfect.
Okay. Away we go. All right. So I'm just going to briefly introduce water stewardship, how it evolved in China, just by way of background to the case study. And then within the scope that Dan discussed, really finding that space, what are the characteristics of the space where water stewardship operated, but then also what are some common problems that aren't unique to China's common issues faced by non-state actors. One caveat is that I haven't been involved for at least the last 2 years. So more recent questions, hopefully Jen will be able to respond to those during the discussion. Okay, so the concept of water stewardship really developed in about 2005, 6, 7 during the decade-long millennium drought here in Australia. It was about building a collaboration between state and non-state actors and corporate actors. And the goal was to engage major industrial scale water users in resource stewardship. So whether that be industrial water users, agricultural water users, our goal was to engage these major water users in good stewardship. It then evolved into a global governance structure and a global standard. And it was really led with pilot projects and demonstration programs. It was during the course of these demonstration programs that there were reciprocal visits. So Dr. Ahui Yang from WWF China was operating the Lower Yangtze program for WWF in China. He came to Australia and looked at some of our water stewardship projects here. I went to China and spoke to some of the water users that he was already working with, and they were looking for a mechanism to promote good water use in the Lower Yangtze area. We developed together some pilot testing projects, developing the concept, how it might be applied in different industries. I think early on we were looking at things like the dairy industry. We managed to attract some Australian aid support for water initiatives in the Asia Pacific region. And that was quite interesting in itself because, of course, Australian aid had typically provided engineering type projects, and a lot of people in the aid organisation were more interested in how an idea like water stewardship might change the conversation, because they'd seen a lot of money invested in water engineering projects that had never really achieved their goals. So it was with that support that we were able to engage an Asia Pacific manager, Jen, who will join us for the discussion. And it was really Jen who built collaboration with local industry and particularly global supply chains in China, features being microelectronics, food and beverage, and textiles. And with Dr. Young, really developed different ways of working with the water stewardship framework. They also then developed partnerships with provincial and municipal government, for example, Environment Protection Bureaus, really for win-win outcomes. So many of our Chinese friends will of course remember that during the middle of the last decade, there was a massive crackdown on water, and particularly water pollution, the Water 10 laws, etc., and a considerable step up in enforcement. And so, you know, there were officials in Environment Protection Bureaus looking for win-win outcomes. In other words, how they could encourage industries in their area to become better water users, rather than closing them down or putting them out of business. And through that, we found a space to operate. So in one area, I remember a local official saying, well, you know, this is all very interesting what you're talking about, you know, these collaborative approaches, but really China works through top-down regulation, so I'm not sure whether there's really a role for this collaborative water stewardship program. But we found that through our interactions with global supply chains, there were expectations on local suppliers that they would not only do the right thing, but provide evidence of doing the right thing. And microelectronics, we work with the Apple supply chain, I think Microsoft and Dell were supply chains that Jen has worked with. And we found a fertile ground in meeting those global expectations. We found also there was a lot more space for experimentation at a municipal level. So these local officials caught between their local development goals and pollution controls, looking for win-win outcomes. And finally, there are opportunities for sharing best practices, mutual learning and respect. So in the photos down the side, for example, Jen had taken people from Kunshan to Taikang, which was a eco-lab site that was the first in China to be certified. On the other hand, the photo down the bottom shows an official from CITIC, the China National Textile and Apparel Council, who came to Australia and talked about what was happening in China to the Australian Fashion Council. So the space that we're really looking at is the Yangtze was much more engaged with what we were doing because the Yangtze was a national priority. We found that by working with local officials, we could build this collaboration for win-win outcomes. We still had to prove results. And talking with Dan a couple of years ago now, or a year or so ago, I sort of had this idea in Western countries like Australia, we tend to see the state and business having a partnership and the community coming along as well. You know, so for instance, when an initiative like water stewardship goes to government here, they might say, well, come along with industry and we'll think about giving you some support, but until you do that, we're not really interested. Whereas in China, I think clearly over the last couple of years, we've seen that economy and community are on a similar basis, and there's a clear control by the state. But in a sense, that creates quite a broad base at the bottom of that triangle to build collaborative projects and to build collaboration. And I think in some senses, certainly the work on water stewardship in China has actually been more successful than in a number of other countries, because there has been this space for collaboration. So finally, though, just some common problems. You know, there are two different systems that we're talking about here between Australia and China, or the US and China, but there are still many similarities. And this little radar graph on the right shows that in China, those who weren't interested in water stewardship were concerned about investment, in other words, the cost, and the operational benefits, but they were less interested in intangible benefits or exceeding compliance requirements. The flip side is that those who were more engaged were more interested in the intangible, the reputational benefits, and exceeding minimal compliance requirements to establish themselves as best practice performers. So, and that was sort of similar to a study we did in Australia. But there's also similar institutional constraints in China to what we find in Western countries. So water is something that's still largely run by engineers who will focus on engineering solutions, or regulators who want to regulate a solution. I think as Dan, you and I discussed one day, really, there is less incentive for a program such as water stewardship, which can be long-term and involve behavior change, as opposed to, well, we're going to go and build a dam or a pipe or whatever, or we're going to introduce a regulation and, you know, with fines and so on. So there's this institutional drag that's the same whether you're in China or a Western country, because of the way people think about how they solve problems. So I think, Petra, that's all I've got for you. But please ask Jen questions, because she's been more involved over the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, Michael. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you do have any questions, we are happy for you to post those in the chat as we proceed on to our fourth and final speaker. Please let me introduce Professor Yijia Jing, Dean of the Institute for Global Public Policy, and also Professor of the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University. Professor Jing, please go ahead.
Thank you, Petra. Michael invited me to say something about the backgrounds of this book to show the relevance and importance of the discussions in it. So basically, I want to talk about two background issues of this book. And first, that's role of China in global environment governance, and then that's the changing China governance model. So for the first background issue, China's role in global environmental governance, we know that due to China's quick economic growth and its huge economic size, the carbon emission of China has exceeded that of all other countries. But good thing is that Chinese government takes a positive and serious policy stance over this issue. And especially after China signed the Paris Agreement, China was not only perceived as a responsible stakeholder of global environmental governance, it was even deemed as a leader in that respect. And in 2020, China announced its two carbon policy goals. The two carbon policy goals mean that China will realize the carbon emission peak in 2030 and the carbon neutrality in 2060. So these ambitious policy goals are certainly very encouraging, but for all the people, including Chinese, we just want to know how we can achieve these goals. What are the sources, resources, instruments, tools available to China? And certainly we think about the actors. How can we engage non-state actors to realize these ambitious goals? So that's the first background issue. And the second one, the governance model, because we know it's still due to economic success of China, Chinese are getting more and more confident about the institutional infrastructure and its capacities. And especially in the past 2 years during the pandemic, there's sharp comparison between China and other countries, especially Western countries, in terms of the governance performance in fighting with COVID-19. So it seems the world has been moving into an era of the competition of governance models. Okay, so people, I mean, both Chinese and foreigners, we are curious about the future of the Chinese governance model. And for this governance model, a central characteristic is the central role played by the state. So we want to learn more how in the future the state of China will interact with the market and with the society. So I think for this book, it will reflects the intersection of these two important background issues, and it reflects the development of the non-state actors in both of these two dimensions. And I want to just give some very brief conclusions among many others. So first, I think environment governance in China is still an area of the dominance of state in terms of the capacities as well as the rules. So due to the laws, the state policies and regulations, the space for non-state actors is still limited. Certainly, non-state actors can do a lot. They can disclose information, they can participate in policy-making process, they can deliver policy briefs, they can do advocacies, they can educate enterprises and citizens. Sometimes they can even make lawsuits against local governments. But to do all this in general, in principle, they have to collaborate with governments. And for many non-state actors, especially NGOs, they have organizational ties with the governments, more or less. So to some extent and to some degree, we can think, okay, for these non-state actors, they are still a kind of extension of the state in China. So this kind of situation may continue to exist in the long term. So we can see partnership in China between state and non-state actors, but the partnership is not that equal. And the second conclusion is that in China, in comparison to many other areas of governance, actually in the area of environmental governance, the non-state actors, they enjoy more autonomy. This is basically due to the attention paid by the governments to this issue and also the attention paid by the general society, especially the expanding middle class in China to this issue. And such autonomy has increased gradually along with the increase of non-state actors' legal status, scope of activities, transfer relations with the governments, as well as professional capacities. Now, I think non-state actors in environment governance has become indispensable, for governing issues in this area. I think this reflects not only the needs of governing capacities to cope with complex issues, but also the increasing recognition of the legitimacy to engage non-state actors in environmental governance. And third conclusion I want to make is that international rules, they still matter for the development of non-state actors in this area in China. Actually, in the early stage of the development of environmental activities and organizations in China in the 1990s, I think these activities and organizations, they were either sponsored or inspired by the Western practices. And still now, I think there's a lot for Chinese NGOs to learn from their international counterparts. And at the same time, China has a global strategy. We have One Belt, One Road initiative, and it's unchanged that China wants to engage more in global governance. And to do that, certainly China cannot just rely on governments or on purely economic organizations. We have to develop our international NGOs. So these NGOs, they have to comply with the international rules. So that's also a rationale that shows us, so we will continue to respect international rules. So I think basically this book reflects these trends and it shows the resilience as well as invariance of the state-centered Chinese society in response to these common global environmental challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your reflections, Professor Jin. We move now to the discussion part of the program, and so I will hand over to Professor Emeritus Oren Young from the University of California, and also to Zhenjian Xu from the Alliance for Water Stewardship Asia Pacific to lead our discussion and field questions from the audience. We don't seem to have a lot of activity in the chat, so perhaps I might also invite anyone who would like to ask a question to either put it in the chat or to use the raise hand function to alert Oren that you'd like to participate in the discussion. Oren, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Petra, and thank you to all the presenters so far. It's a very rich discussion. I thought we might try to focus around 3 or 4 topics. One is to make sure we actually understand what we mean by non-state actors. So what is a non-state actor? What are the types of non-state actors? Are they distinctive in the China context? The second is the question of kind of strategies and mechanisms. How is it that non-state actors, whoever they are, actually make a difference? And are there a variety of different strategies and mechanisms? Do they differ in significant ways from what people who study Western systems have tended to focus on? A third is the question of effectiveness. Dan, you're right. I do want to raise the question of effectiveness. How do we determine whether a non-state actor is actually making a measurable, identifiable, causally significant difference? In other words, how does the outcome differ from what would have happened in the absence of the effort of the non-state actor? And the fourth is maybe to go to some question of future directions and trends to get into what Ijia was saying about trends. So if that's okay, let's try to see how far we can get with these several different substantive topics, starting with this question of non-state actors. So Ijia made the comment that in some significant respects, non-state actors in China seem to be extensions of the state. Whereas in Western thinking, there tends to be, I think, a much kind of sharper differentiation. A non-state actor is something that's different from the state or different from the government in some more fundamental sense. So we need to sort of clarify the range of situations we're looking at. And maybe we can come back to the examples that have been used in the presentations of the Alliance for Water Stewardship and IPE. So as I understand it, and maybe Zhenjian can talk about this, the Alliance for Water Stewardship is a international non-state actor, but it has a China branch. And so what exactly is the status of the Alliance for Water Stewardship in China? Zhenjian, can you talk to that question a bit?
Sure. Thank you, Oren. I think many of us working in international NGOs might be aware of the newly introduced law on regulating activities of international NGOs in China. It was a few years ago, and then many international NGOs find their own way to adapt to the law or obey the law and finding its own legal structure operating in China. So I think here I'll just give a sort of a quite general overview of the different forms that international NGO can operate legally in China. I think there are mainly two two channels. One is setting up international NGO representative office in China, where this representative office is operating on behalf of the international NGOs, and it has to have a supervision department relevant its business scope, whether it's environment or public health or education or other social issues. Then every year it has to report to its supervision department in terms of its core activities, financing, spending, and others. And then I think a lot of large international environmental NGOs have chosen this pathway. People like WWF, TNC, and others have in the early days already registered as a international NGO representative office. Some other type of organizations, mostly trade associations or membership-based organizations, might also have arranged as a pure for-profit type of organization. So maybe we can vaguely say it is a sort of social enterprise. This term has been quite popular in China nowadays as well, which means it is registered as a for-profit organization, but at the same time, it has its own clear mission and vision for doing social good. So some trade-related type of organization have registered and operated as a purely for-profit type of organization in China. But somehow, I think at the moment, overall, the government still have a very clear message that we're welcoming and open for international NGO to participate in various issue governance in China.
And what about your own organization, the Water Stewardship Alliance? What exactly is the status of your organization in China?
In fact, we are transitioning from a for business company structure to a representative office structure at the moment. So we're working closely with the Shanghai government to establish a rep office in China.
And then Shenzhen IPE, of course, is a very different model. It's a Chinese organization. It's not linked really, is it, to some international NGO or non-state actor? It's homegrown in a sense. Is that right?
Yes. We are, like, as I said, like, we are 100% like Chinese NGO. We're registered in China. So I think in our case, I'm not really in charge of the admin side, but I can briefly say, like, yes, we are the type that's like purely non-governmental, non-state. For example, like, we actually have, like, we collect information from Environmental Bureau website, but we don't get it, like, we don't have any link with them, right? We just go to their website and then we collect it via public links. We don't have an API, we don't have any exchange with them. So in that way, I think we aren't really, as an extension of the state or government. Having said that, I think it is really important for, IPE, when we operate, we position ourselves as, not being against the government. We're saying that we provide a supplement to what the government are promoting, which is wanting more facility to be in compliance with laws and regulations. So I think that position is really important, is that we are a helper, we provide a solution, instead of saying that we are, standing up and say the government are not doing enough. One thing that I haven't shared just now is the PITI index that we did for 10 years, but we've stopped doing it. At the time when we developed the PITI, we're really looking into different local environmental bureaus and say whether you have disclosed enough information. But even when we were doing that, we are not saying, certain cities or certain provinces, you haven't done enough. What we are trying to promote is you should be doing more as, those leaders. And then once you have disclosed that information, what can that help the local environment, protection. So I think that's a really important position, operating as a Chinese NGO. But we also face the situation as that if we want to have more foundation money coming from overseas, that's a bit similar to what Jen shared just now, because of the new regulations on international NGOs. We also know quite a few NGO who are like gungos. I think that's something, quite a feature in China as well. Some of those gungos are really helpful as well because they have, close links with the government. And sometimes, working with gungos means that you can, leverage more, government impact and influence as well. So I think it's just, you just have to like play around and find that delicate balance.
So, but am I correct in understanding that quite a lot of the data that you use is actually data that's collected by government agencies?
What I mean is one thing, the core sort of information that IPE's environmental database provide is environmental violation records. And when I say environmental violation record, it means, say, the local Environmental Protection Bureau in Beijing went out to enforce laws and regulations. They need to go out and do the inspections and see, are facilities in China operating in line with the regulation? They need to have permit, they need to discharge in compliance in line with the standards, etc. And if a facility does not comply, they would issue a order and a fine, and that we call a environmental violation. And then we will collect that violation after it is being publicly released by the local Environmental Protection Bureau. Because according to laws and regulations in China, those violations has to be published by the government. But because it's scattered around, so many websites, it is very difficult for, brands to actually, check. They can't check more than thousands of websites. So that's what we do.
So you, in effect, take these records of violations determined by the EPBs, and then you go to work in terms of contacting the violators and trying to get them to correct their behavior.
Yes, and then we also ask brands to do that as well, because non-state actors such as NGO has a relatively small voice in China. So when we contact a facility, it's 99% chance that they don't reply to us. But if we, contact brands and ask brands to contact their suppliers, we kind of find someone else to do the job for us. And because brands has the purchasing power and purchasing pressure there, so they can tell suppliers, if you do not improve your environmental performance, if you continue to have violation, I won't have any business order with you. And so that's what we are trying to do is, we can't do the job because our voices are small, but we can find other people to do the job.
So Dan, you wanted to jump in here with something, but let me just say that neither of these cases is quite the same as what you told us initially about the Xie Danwei and the Shihui 20. Those are yet other categories of non-state actors, yes?
Right. I'd like to, first of all, it's wonderful what Yijia and Shangchang and Zhenzhen, are making quite clear. It's no secret that China has a different state, private, or whatever you want to call it, relation than the US or Australia. So that's not a question. A reason I love teaching and being with all my China colleagues is to make me reflect on my own country. So, for example, I became interested in non-state actors during the Vietnam War when I learned that this think tank, the RAND Corporation, a private organization, seemed to be heavily involved in US military policy. How could that be? Then I learned RAND was the tip of the iceberg. It turns out since World War II, much of the United States government is run by private contractors. Some of them, like Lockheed, used to be 100% business, or Booz Allen. Now they're almost 100% government. So in what sense are they non-state actors? A second qualification, so I'm a lawyer. So I teach classes, and all students in China, the US, NGO means non-government organization. What does that mean? And in the US, if you want to be an NGO of any consequence, you register with your locality, no problem, but you get a tax, want to get a tax exemption, you've got to say things which may limit your political affiliation. And so we may take 100% of your money from the government. But the interesting thing, and the China hands on this, I know Catherine knows, Tony Sage at Harvard wrote a famous article 30 years ago about China negotiating the state, that the trick for a China non-state actor, and this is what Jen and Cheng Cheng are talking about, is you got to know how to deal with, work back and forth from the state. But that's exactly the way our advocacy, most of our advocacy organizations work in the US. My colleagues who are in the Department of Justice say, we hope NRDC sues us so that we can then go to the White House and say we're being sued. And then these people will go back and forth from the government into to the non-state sector. So the point here is not simply what is China, but the value from an American and I hope Australian perspective of comparative understanding of what it is that's going on in our own countries.
Let me just broaden this in one direction. A lot of discussions of non-state actors have focused around this notion of corporate social responsibility, assuming that we're talking about corporations as, in some sense, private actors, which are therefore non-state. But in China, we're often talking about state-owned enterprises. So does it make sense to talk about corporate social responsibility in relationship to state-owned enterprise? That was a question that someone was sent to me in advance by the organizers that someone had raised. How do we think about CSR, corporate social responsibility, when the corporation is a state-owned enterprise? Does someone have a thought about that?
Oren, this is Jen. Oh, sorry. I think just quickly giving an example of the Alliance for Water Stewardship's governance, where we try to keep the balance of representation of corporate, community, civil society, and public sector in our member pool as well as the board, because somehow we are setting up standards for corporate for good water stewardship practice. And we want the standard to be accessible as well as credible. How far we set the bar is somehow, as personally I see, as a result of bargaining among these three different stakeholder groups. But on the other hand, in our governance, we also struggled with how we see some industrial association, whether they represent private interest of their particular sector or purely business interest. For example, we have WBCSD as a member, who is a quite important American NGO, sort of represent in the market as a CSR driving NGO, but somehow it's driven by industrial business members. In China, same thing, like CITIC, but CITIC is slightly different. As Dan pointed out, CITIC used to be the Ministry of Textile, and then it turns to a pure industrial sector association. It of course represents the sector's own voice. For example, when there is a new wastewater discharge standard being introduced, the industrial association will evaluate its feasibility as well as the cost to obey with the new standard and trying to make a voice with the government. But on the other hand, it's also internally driving the sector towards a more sustainable practice. So I think some NGO have a very clear sort of multi-stakeholder governance. It's easy to understand, but on the other hand, there are trade associations or sector associations do represent quite a unique sector or a group of stakeholder. Then it might actually represent its own voice, I think.
So what I'm taking away from this conversation is that it may be that a simple distinction between states and non-state actors isn't really very helpful. When we look at the sort of policy arena in a particular country, we're really interested in what are the different kinds of animals, sets of organizations that are playing within this arena, and is the collection of these players, the sets of animals that are playing in the policy arena, somewhat different in the China context than it is in the US context or the Australian context or the European Union context. So really what we will need is a rich understanding of the sort of the collection of players and what their identities are and where they fit into this sort of fairly complex playing field of the policy arena. But let's move on to the question of sort of strategies and mechanisms and so forth. In the American discussion, a great deal of the analysis of non-state actors or NGOs and whatnot focuses around, can they influence the making of laws? Can they play a role in influencing how laws are made and what their content are? There's a lot of discussion once laws are made about the role of non-state actors in the courts, bringing court cases. Ija mentioned a little bit about courts, but in the discussion about the Alliance for Water Stewardship and IPE, I didn't hear very much about influencing lawmaking or the role of court cases. I heard a lot about other mechanisms of influence. And so maybe we need to develop a kind of a taxonomy or a kind of an understanding of the characteristic forms of influence. There are ways in which these actors that we're talking about can get a grip and actually influence the trajectory of things. So for example, Shanshan, in talking about IPE, really talked about the power of information, about publicizing behavior and trying to bring pressure to bear on actors who may be sensitive for one reason or another regarding the publicization of what they're doing. And your example of, I forget what it was, your graph where you showed the declining, possibly 25% reduction is perhaps testimony to the power of information. Michael, you talked about a place to operate, and you talked about providing assistance and providing learning opportunities. So are there certain kinds of strategies for influencing behavior of the actors, of those we're concerned with, which are perhaps characteristic of how these processes work in China? Michael, Zhenjian, Shanshan, others, what do you think about the kind of range of strategies that are characteristic of the China process here?
But I think if you look at the difference between private law and state law, the difference is in enforcement, whereas state law has the authority of the state, which, you know, in theory has a monopoly on violence. Private law has no such authority, and it works through other mechanisms, whether it's through exposure and reputational pressure, or some other form of pressure in terms of, it may be admission to a certain market or whatever. So private laws develop their own authority, but it's not necessarily the authority of the state. And for that reason, they require more cooperation and collaboration.
But the game is about trying to influence behavior, whether it's the behavior of corporations or the behavior of all kinds of actors. And so the question is, are there certain strategies, procedures for making a real difference in affecting behavior, which seem to be developing as characteristic strategies that work well in a Chinese context, which may be somewhat different in nature from the parallel strategies that work well in other settings. Dan, you wanted to?
Yeah, a couple of points. I hope what I'm saying is correct. This is all what I've learned from Ma Jun and Zhen and Ija. So first, if we're talking about helping government enforce the law, I think the basic discovery I made was the civil service is small. The China Ministry of Environment has the policy and planning people are in Xiedanwei, the China Academy of Environmental Planning, and the policy office, same across the board. Similarly, the universities, Ija himself is called on. The Shanghai government wants to know how to develop a policy for something. You remember, Oren, Ija and I and you had a comment about whether or not this is effective. You and I suggested at Tsinghua, perhaps the #1 power school, they're actually making policy. And I think someone said, well, they think they're making policy. So on the one hand, and second, on enforcement, again, the Xiedanwei are the enforcement entities. At the local level, there is not civil service. In the last 5 years, one of the major reforms to make environmental compliance work was inspection teams from Beijing, which are composed of Xiedanwei. On going to court, 2014, the China People's Congress changed the law to say that certain NGOs can go to court and sue not government, but in polluters. And so what's happened is really Chinese characteristics. There are a handful of NGOs that do this, a small number. But the China government then said the government prosecutors can go to court to do environmental public interest, so that the great preponderance of public interest lawsuits are now brought by the government, although there is a role for the NGOs. In the US, when we think of public interest law, it's a private organization or a private individual going to court. So that's an example of where a Western notion, public interest law, has been literally adopted in China, but with quite different role for government and non-governmental people. But
let me come back to your comments about the Xiedanwei. In an American setting, we often think of environmental organizations being active in trying to develop environmental ideas and strategies which may later on surface in actual formal legal policies. In other words, they play some role as innovators, as sort of intellectual developers of ideas. And what you're saying is that in the Chinese context, at least some significant part of this function of intellectual innovation, development of new innovative ideas, may actually be handled through the Xiedanwei.
well, let me punctuate it, and I'm glad we have Ding Changsheng on the phone, because we also have the concept in the West of policy entrepreneur. I never knew about that until I began to teach at Tsinghua, the notion that there is someone, could be just an average citizen, who's got an idea about a policy, won't stop, there's a crisis, and the leader says, who's got a policy? And if we think about the notion of policy entrepreneur, I can't think of a better example than Ma Jun, who created the IPE, bringing open information, an idea he picked up from Bob Percival's textbook when he was at Yale. But the idea function, I think, maybe also in relation to what in the West we would call policy entrepreneur. Maybe Shen and Ija can comment on. This is also kind of an attractive notion taught in the, the public policy schools, policy entrepreneur.
So do we have policy entrepreneurs in this sense in the Chinese setting? And are Xiedanwei really one of the hotbeds for generation of ideas? It may, when the crisis arises or when someone is looking for a new policy initiative, they turn to.
May I also just jump in?
Ija, what do you think?
I might just point you to some questions in the chat as well, Oren, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Can you see those? Beginning with Andrew Crawford, I think.
Let me go back up to them.
Maybe Ija could answer the question while you're looking at the.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can speak a bit
About policy
about policy
entrepreneurs. What do you
entrepreneurs.
think?
Yeah, asking for policy entrepreneurs, that's kind of new phenomenon for China, but not that new. But anyway, if the government has a very hierarchical culture, then it's very difficult to have policy entrepreneurs within the government. But we see that both within the government and also without government, this kind of phenomenon has been increasing in China. And for the non-state actors, actually, they have more place to play the role of policy entrepreneurs, because there's no that kind of, typical hierarchy for these organizations. So Dan has mentioned Ma Jun, and we can also think about many other cases and also in many other areas, not just environmental governance. And I think usually people may think, okay, due to the connections of the non-state actors to the government, maybe it's difficult for them to exercise their independent judgments to do policy advocacy. I think that is true. But at the same time, that kind of connections with the government also facilitates the entry into the policy process. For example, they are trusted by the government, then it's easy for the government, to invite these organizations and their representatives into the policy process. So it has become a kind of typical phenomenon in China for these policy entrepreneurs if they are external to the government. For these non-state actors, if they want to influence policies, they try their best to build all kinds of collaborative relations with the government. So this seems to be different to the Western countries. I think it is true that for Western countries, non-profit or NGOs, they want to have good relations with government, but they try to keep a kind of arm's length to the government. But in China, that's different. So actually, for these policy entrepreneurs or for the non-state actors, if they want to really make a difference, they have to pay attention to two things. They have to be professionally competent. I mean, they can provide things that the government cannot provide. At the same time, they have to be trusted. I mean, at least in terms of the political view. So in Chinese, they have to be 又红又专 at the same time. I mean, they have to be professional and red at the same time. I think that's a general strategy for these policy entrepreneurs.
Looking at the question in the chat, I think we can wrap some of them together in raising issues about effectiveness. How effective are these actors of various kinds? One of the questions had to do with the setting of corporate environmental standards. Do these actors play a significant role in setting these standards? Another question had to do with issues of enforcement. And Dan, of course, spoke to the question of the Xie Danwei. Do they make a difference in that respect? Another question had to do with this notion of entrepreneurs, which Ija has just been talking about. To what extent do these policy entrepreneurs, if they're trusted and if they're professional, and if they make the right kind of alliances with actors in the governmental sector, to what extent are they able to really affect the discourse, affect the direction in which things go? So this is a fundamental issue that we all struggle with when we think about all of these questions, is how can we determine, what's the methodology for determining how successful, how effective these various actors are? You all must have the same experience. I mean, Shanshan with IPE and Zhenjian, you must think a lot about, are we being effective? And could we improve our effectiveness? What are your thoughts about measuring and assessing and evaluating the effectiveness of the efforts of these various actors in the environmental arena?
Right.
Sandra, what do
Thanks,
you
Art. I'll make a start. Sorry.
Sure.
I think it's really, really important to assess the effectiveness, and that's certainly something that we've been asking ourselves day in and out. And I think I have like two examples, which I think sort of either can answer a question, or I think would be something that we can, a good example is, one thing is back to, corporate information disclosure. So very recently, it was December last year that the Chinese government issued a new requirement. They listed out 4 types of companies who, from beginning from next year, would be mandatory to disclose environmental information. And that includes both whether when they are in compliance with laws and regulation, they need to disclose information, doing an explanation. That also includes pollutant release and transfer information, especially hazardous, poisonous chemical information. So we see that regulation as a very unprecedented measure and move from the government. And we know that this is the drafting of the regulation is really something a research think tank under the MEE, the Ministry of Environment, Ecology and Environment, drafted it. But then we also know that that's something that we have been promoting throughout the years. So I think it just makes me think that, first of all, as a non-state actor in China, it's important that, we have been promoting this since 2013. We have developed our own platform, asking suppliers to come to our platform to do the disclosure. We have been doing policy suggestions and doing proposal as well by I'm sure you know that Lianghui, so the NPC and CPPCC sessions. You can submit as an NGO or as an expert or as anyone, you can submit policy suggestions. And back in 2019, we have received reply from the government saying, okay, well accepted, we will consider it. But it still takes time. It's not until the end of last year that there's new regulations coming out. So I feel that so I think it's important that, first of all, you do the policy suggestions by whichever channels that you can access. Either you work with Research Institute or you work with CITI or whatever. But it's also important that you continue to, you create your own platform. It's just out there. People can, facilities can already disclose information. We're not saying we will wait for the government to do something. We will have our platform, and it just demonstrates that it's doable. And once you demonstrate that it's doable, the government, if they recognize that, they can step and say, okay, let's do it and scale up. And so I think it's really important when we talk about effectiveness is scaling things up. We're not just asking 100 facilities to do in the disclosure. It's not 1,000. It's a few thousand every year. And now if the government starts out, the regulations comes out, it could be tens of thousands. So I think that's what is very effective. And the last one I think is waste sorting in China. Waste sorting, it's being way more effective in Shanghai, but in Beijing it's very slow. And so we, as an organization, we also think, how can we do what as a non-state actor in China, can we, promote waste sorting in China so that, it's much increase the rate of recycling, etc. So the government is doing what they can. They set regulations. And so what we do is we're asking people to take a photo of how the waste sorting is in their own neighborhood, in their own communities, and upload a photo. And then we use that photo to do a rating. So we can tell that by, it's not as scientific as, doing a research, but then at least you have the photo. It shows that certain cities are doing better than the other cities. Then we're taking that information, going to the government and say, look, some certain cities are doing better because they're doing such and such. Some cities are not doing enough because they don't have certain measures. So I think we don't know when, that more cities will be able to adopt, waste sortings and making it much better. But this is what we do. We don't stop there from waiting for the government to do what the government are doing. We're just pushing what we can.
Thanks, Shangshan. I see the time is running, and I think we're going to have to wrap up at this point. Let me just very, very briefly make a couple of comments. It's obvious to me that there's a very rich array of actors that are active in China when it comes to issues of environmental quality. They don't map in a simple, direct, one-to-one way onto the kinds of actors that people talk about in the American or other Western context, but that doesn't necessarily matter. The important thing is to get a clear sense of the nature of these actors and how they operate and the extent to which they actually make a difference in terms of where the system as a whole is going with respect to large-scale environmental issues. And I think when we look at these examples, we see a rich array of strategies and the beginning of a process of sharpening and clarifying and developing a kind of a arsenal of strategies which are clearly beginning to make a difference. And so as various people pointed out at the outset, Dan perhaps in particular, since China looking toward the future on a global scale is such a fundamentally important actor, how these various non-state actors develop in China and the strategies they develop is going to be crucial to how we develop globally from the point of view of environmental quality. But Petra, let me turn it back to you.
Oh, thank you, Oren. I think I just have the final word, which is to thank all our speakers very much for joining us today, our discussants, for such an interesting and rich and topical discussion on non-state actors and environmental governance in China. Thank you also to our attendees for your participation and your questions. And we hope that you will watch out for further research coming from this great group of researchers and activists, and also that you might join us again for future events. Thank you very much, everyone.